Donc, à la fin de cette journée, c'est donc une convergence en fait assez heureuse qui permet de saluer.
At the end of this day, it's a happy convergence, which enables us to welcome and pay tribute to the work of the Turkish architect Ersen Gürsel and place it under the auspices of the Bauhaus and his social transdisciplinary vision. Marie-Christine Labordette reminded us in her speech that the Bauhaus was destroyed by the Nazi regime. It's my turn to remind you that starting in the 30s, the modernistic regime of Mustafa Kemal wove close ties with the visionaries of the Bauhaus and opened the door of its universities to its members in exile. Ersen Gürsel gave me a course in the history of Turkey some time ago, and I quote him, "The founder of Turkish modernism is Sedat Haki Eldam, who came back to Turkey in 1930 after having worked with Hans Pulsig." Bruno Taut arrived in 1930 at the university, Mimar Sinan University, and created the course in urbanism with Seyfi Arkan, who came back from Germany. The director of urbanism of Berlin, Martin Wagner, arrived in 1937. His assistant, Mehmed Ali Handan, became a great professor, the one I enjoy the most. He explained that architecture didn't consist in designing buildings, but in shaping the environment, human life, tradition, the discourse. He described the city as rendering concrete the political and social context, and I was fortunate to be his assistant for 9 years. Ersen Gürsel is a major figure in the progressist Turkey, an architect and urbanist professor. He engaged and developed what he calls comprehensive understanding, what is translated by l'analyse globale des situations, the global analysis of situations, or integrative analysis. This transdisciplinary approach was applied first by Ersen Gürsel in tourism, which became a major activity in Turkey at the time. And architects who really understood the social and economic challenge of leisure in Europe. There weren't many of them since the 60s, only a handful of them. Marcel Breuer, George Candelas, Ersen Gürsel, who for 30 years was the architect of Bodrum and who transformed the leisure industry in a resource with a balanced regional development and a self-development model. There are major projects that he developed for public spaces, Istanbul, Smyrna, and the coastal cities. But it's not the happiest part of his work. I quote him, "It is difficult to save the public space today in Turkey." This great figure of the debate today is engaging his moral authority in the defense of the public space. The enemies are powerful, and this commitment requires authority, competence, and also courage, which is not often invoked in architecture.
Sayın konuklar, hoş geldiniz. Merhaba.
Welcome to everyone. Good afternoon. Marie-Hélène really described things very well, and there's not much for me to say. And we heard a lot from my architect colleagues. What can I say as the fifth speaker? I prepared myself, but how can I explain things? I'm an elderly man, and it is difficult to summarize things. But I'll try and give you a summary. Let's see how we go about this. In 2014, the Chamber of Architects gave me an award. It was a major award for me, and a few years later, I'm receiving this award from the Global Awards, and I think this will probably be a crowning moment in my career. Concerning the Cité de l'Architecture and the Global Awards for Sustainable Architecture, I wish to thank the director in charge of the development. I wish to thank the director of the Cité de l'Architecture and Marie-Christine Labordette, and all the members of the jury. I began architecture at the Fine Arts School in 1950, and I received my degree a few years later. And I became the assistant of Handan, as Marie-Christine recalled a moment ago. And I became the assistant of Handan. He was very different from other professors as regards urban planning. He said it was related to social and political values. And what my professor said during the courses led me to planning. When I began my academic career in 1962, I took part in a variety of projects on a variety of scales. And looking at those in chronological order, they can be divided into 4 different groups. The first group was the period between 1962 and 1969. Those are the first years of my career in academia. I was enthusiastic. I went on visits with my students. I spent time in the library. And during my free time, I talked about sculpture with other students. I started drawing up plans for a variety of locations. There was a competition for a project in Anatolia, and a sculptor, Kemal Bachelot, who was the same age as me, took part in this competition with me. We had a different mission. We had designed this sculpture as a scientific project, and we arrived second. And the dean in 1962 made our project into a concrete achievement, which you see here. And it became a symbol of the university, a symbolic value of the university. And I'm very happy to have been taken part in this project. Years later, with 2 of my assistants, I took part in another international competition, an urban planning project for the city of Sidi. And we were awarded the project, and that was a turning point in my professional life. In 1970, with the organizers of the project, I founded EPA, and I still work for this office. The creation of this agency was the crowning point of the first phase of my career. Later on, we worked on the planning for the protection of CIDE. And that was the second phase. It corresponded to a different concept. Previously, we were engaged in urban planning. Now, I moved on to a different dimension. CIDE and the surrounding area had to be reorganized in a Mediterranean environment and for the purpose of tourism.
Evet. Akdeniz iklim bölgesindeki bu proje alanı.
So this is the Mediterranean. This is an area where the Mediterranean climate is very present. And here we are 12 kilometers inland. And there is a triangle formed by this space. And there are two villages located in this region. And these are typical villages of migrants. And in the area where the planning was to take place, there is a pine tree forest, and there are beaches. It's a natural environment. And in the middle of that, at the center, there's an antique archaeological site, which has to be taken into consideration. And in this region, there is a population of immigrants from Crete. And this population has special characteristics. You see here on the map in red the civilian buildings or homes, and the rest are antique remains. And there's also a necropolis. Now, what was the objective of the project? In the project that we were entrusted with, we were to create a capacity for tourists of 15,000 to 16,000 beds, and also preserve the cultural environment in a sustainable way. We needed to create a concept. And up until then, there was a traditional planning technique which we were familiar with. It was a two-dimensional planning technique. And this technique didn't enable us to solve the issue of the planning for CIDE. So we set out to find a new way of solving the problem, and we worked on it for 2 years, and we found a different way of solving the problem. The whole of the area had to be open, and the social and economic and cultural environment had to be preserved. And we needed a concept of space, and this is how the project was to adopt the local culture. That was one of the most important considerations. Even in architecture, there is this constant development. What we saw is the following. We needed to provide a capacity of 15,000 beds for tourists, which were centered in 3 locations, and we prevented an extension of this hotel capacity or accommodation capacity in the area. At the time in Turkey, we wanted to preserve the coastline. And many different hotels were extending all the way to the beach as if the sea belonged to them and as if the beaches belonged to them. So it was decided to move the buildings away from the coastline between 150 and 350 meters away from the coastline, and consider the coastal area as a public area. And we needed installations for the tourists, but at the same time preserve the forest and preserve the villages. And we needed to preserve the social life in this specific environment. We needed to protect the ecology and the environment, and it was a major social project. How are we going to do this? The people living in the area had to be involved in the definition of the project. The project extended over a three-year period, and a second thing happened. At the time, all of the archaeological work was represented by the buildings which housed them. And there were over 250 buildings. And we decided to identify all these buildings. And there was a list of 98 that were left. And in these 98 buildings, no housing, no accommodation needed to be left. And we needed to restructure the coastline to preserve the beaches. Now, let's go back to CD. You see the village here. You see the network of homes, of houses, which are typical stone houses. And this is what we were asked to do. We were asked to produce something which corresponded to the local fabric. What was proposed was a concept of streets. This is the entrance of the antique site at Sidi. And we decided to include Sidi in the definition of our project. In the process of the definition of our project, it was a competition. What we stated is that there was going to be a restoration, and we wanted to ensure that the social life would be preserved. In 1974, the mayor invited me to a meeting, and he invited me and said that the meeting would be very interesting for me. After the city project, there was the Aktur project on the Mediterranean for Bodrum and Datça. Those were holiday villages. And when we started the project, we realized two things. What was important wasn't only the planning work. We needed to find an agreement between the local fabric and the architectural project. We were a team of very young architects, and we started working in the villages, and ideas were proposed and discussed. And our colleagues had been very much impressed by the local fabric. But the climate was different from the other regions, and we needed a different architectural design. But there had to be convergence between the project and planning. And we reinterpreted all of the examples that we were shown. And we decided to take stock. We're on the Dacha and Bodrum Peninsula, and the Aktor project is located here. The project involved 750 housing units and 1,250 for Dacha. And again, we considered that the beaches were a public good and had to be preserved. And we proposed two different architectural approaches in accordance with the local fabric. And again, we wanted to have a harmony with the local area. In conclusion, we decided on the following. In our EPA office, we made a proposal for organized tourism. What we had learned through the project in Side, and we considered that the people had to be integrated in the dynamism of the Aktor project. And this gave us a different perspective. And the season, the tourism season, was extended from 4 months to 6 months. But the habitat structure had to be preserved. And the streets opened up onto the beach in a very natural way. And this was important for the sustainability of the region. And by preserving the local fabric, we're able to say that it was a successful project. This is the plan for the Aktor project. We started from our own architectural project. And this is how things were transformed. The streets open up onto the sea. And when you get to Dacha, the beach extends on a 3-kilometer stretch. You see the structure of the habitat, and the streets open onto the sea. And we reached a point where when I went back, it looked as if time had stopped. It was timeless. And look at what we have now. This design made the area more lively. And the timelessness is very well explained by the structure. In 1977, the Bosphorus University involved us in a project in the Golden Horn Basin. There was the first electrical plant built in 1913, and the industry had extended in the Golden Horn Basin. The urban planning dated back to the 1930s, and a variety of industrial facilities had settled in the area. But over time, the industrial waste had become extremely worrying, and it was so badly structured that the area had lost its soul and its identity. In 1977, when we started working on the project, this was the map. Look at the map here. There are different plants located here, and there are different sources that feed the city, and the construction extends all the way down, and we were losing Istanbul. And we started working on a transformation plan. The industry had to lose some of its importance, and these plants could no longer use these resources. So we had to develop a project which connected the past with the present or the future. We had to make it livable. And we started at the time, and we're still not finished. We're still working on cultural and housing projects. And there are a lot of industrial structures or shipyards that were removed to give way to more sustainable projects. You see, there was a true transformation in this area. We received an invitation from the mayor of Bodrum, and he said, there's so much pressure from the investors in tourism. How can we channel them, so to speak, to avoid a deterioration of the beaches and the orange groves? And we set up a team, and we started working in premises which were lent to us by the Bodrum City Hall. And our objective was to preserve the beaches which the hotel owners or managers considered as their own property. The first thing we did was to meet the inhabitants, and we ensured that the coastal strip would be transformed into a public space, and we made sure that the building would be controlled and that the orange groves would be preserved. And this is still the case. And the peninsula is now protected. It has been preserved. And people wonder how we were able to preserve these natural spaces. All we did is that we redefined the urban model in consultation with the inhabitants. We ensured that their expectations would be integrated into the project. The inhabitants were afraid the building permits were going to deteriorate the roads and were going to infringe on their orange groves. Their fear was that if permits were given to the hotel managers, their heirs would sell their property to the hotels and waste their money, spend all of the money. We were able to convince these people that everything had to be done to preserve the natural environment. And these people ended up staying on their land, and the coast was preserved as a public good. And on the beaches, a number of inns or boarding houses were opened. There can be mistakes, and there may be things that happen, and sometimes you are obliged to take a different position, but it is my intention to preserve the roads and the land. And the roads have been opened up to the pedestrians. There is a ring road around the cities, but we have created long stretches, long walks around the coastline, around the beach. And between Bitas and Bodrum, we were able to organize a pedestrian walk, and it's a remarkable living area. This is the project I'm talking about. This is architect. There's the Aktor project, and this is the last project. We were supposed to go all the way to here, and on this 4-kilometer wide stretch, there is one thing we were unable to do. This land, which belonged to the treasury, was sold. And there is now an investment on this piece of land. It was initially designed as a buffer area. There was a change of policy, and there's nothing we could do about it. But at that time, it wasn't planned. And we made very simple drawings, and we explained things to the local population. And we talked to people, and now we have this long 40-minute long walk, and there's the possibility of meeting with the population. And these walks, these boardwalks, have a direct impact on the local population. They were happy to have homes where rooms could be rented, or small inns rather than large hotels. So all of these projects were urban or semi-urban transformation projects, and that ended in 1986. And following a request from an investor, there was a building permit on a former cemetery. And I was asked to do a project for a hotel. That is when the third part of my career began. And these are architectural type projects. And all of these projects were built in the Bodrum Peninsula.
Bu şeyde evre projeleri, bu evreleri, bu dönem projelerinde birdenbire bir şey öne çıkmaya başladı. Yine çevre üzerindeki ve Bodrum yerel mimarisi üzerinde bütün mimarları...
Again, we needed to preserve the structure of Bodrum and preserve the local environment and the characteristics of the built fabric, which seemed monotonous and which led to a lot of debate. And I said that should be stopped. But at the local level, there is a culture for the habitat, which is associated to the presence of a material. And all the buildings were built with this local material. But did we have craftsmen capable of working with this material? For years, we've been working with craftsmen who worked with stone or wood, and we really love these craftsmen. I forgot to say one thing. In the Aktor project, EPA had two partners who decided to pursue their academic career and stopped working with me within the office of EPA. And I was joined by a young colleague in 1973, and I had said, stop. I was beginning to be bored with this academic career, which offered me no opportunity for action. I wanted to be on the ground, to touch the stone and the wood and have quarrels with the craftsmen, and boy, did I enjoy that. And once misunderstandings are finally solved, there's no greater pleasure than to talk to these people. And then you can let them talk, or you can let them work, and you go home to Istanbul, and they will know exactly how they're supposed to work. And I've always worked with these craftsmen, and they're probably unemployed by now. So at the time, the first project was the Manastir Hotel. There were trees, and there was a 400-year-old oak tree. We had asked a specialist to determine the age of this tree, and we wanted to preserve the environmental structure, and I wondered how I could preserve the environment and build the project. Manastir was this piece of land, and this tree had to be an integral part of my design. It's important for the local population because the area was a former cemetery, and there were people who came to rest under this oak tree, who came for a smoke, and who came and rested and looked into the distance. People didn't talk about the design of the hotel. We had to ensure that the environment would be preserved, and the hotel had to be as discreet as possible. And what was important for me, that was my choice. An architectural building has to fit in its environment, and there has to be interaction between the two. And I had my experience, and there was the concept of space and a sense of belonging to a space, to a specific location. I wanted an original design which would fit with the local geographical characteristics. And when I went to the beaches, I looked at the stones, and the stones are not all identical, and the geographical conditions showed that the buildings could not be uniform. And in Turkey, there has been a uniformization of buildings. The height is important, and there are different elements that have to be taken into consideration. You should do this and not do that. But other than that, we can reinterpret the ecological environment. And this will give us the opportunity to create original structures. But one should avoid leaving aside the abstraction of the project. I'll show you a few sketches. There was this oak tree, the former cemetery with a chapel, and there was a view looking down onto the Mediterranean, and you have these little streets which were lined with trees. And it was also a place of memory for the local population. You had to preserve the memory of this space, the soul of the space. People talk today about the duty to preserve the memory. It has to be present in the spaces, which have to be the witnesses of the past, our memory. So this is the building that was built there, the streets that open onto the sea. And one day there was another project which I was very enthusiastic about. We were on a hillside, and it could be seen from everywhere. It was so visible that it had me trembling or shaking for a long time. I didn't want to make a mistake. I looked at the surrounding area, and I had to accept the responsibility of creating something there. And one day, I decided to accept this challenge. And so, again, you have this natural environment. There was a kind of lighthouse, these blocks of stone. And I was always intrigued by the walls of these citadels. How could I integrate that? When I was sailing in the Aegean Sea, I looked at these walls, these ramparts, with nostalgia. And a lot of the buildings had been abandoned, but the walls, the ramparts remained there. There was a transformation in Bodrum, but we needed a new sustainable environment. And so I focused on these ramparts, on these walls. And when you enter the hotel, the concept is very different. And from a bedroom, you have this view, and these balconies open onto the sea. The walls are made of stone. And apart from being elements that belong to the building, it belongs to the whole. Inside the building, we used local construction material. That's the outside of the hotel. There's a patio which opens onto the blue Mediterranean. It was a wonderful project, which I was very enthusiastic about. In the back, you see people who are sunbathing. And due to a happy coincidence, there was another project in Bodrum, the Queen Ada Hotel, on a cove. There was an Orthodox church, and this Orthodox church played an essential role in the designing of our project. Once in a while, you need to draw this sort of sketch, and with the employers, the bosses, you need to establish a relationship, especially if these are private investors and not public investors. You need a privileged relationship. And this is what we have. Again, it opens onto the sea. It's the Aegean Sea. And on the other side, there's the Lithium Mountain. You have wood associated with the stone. And the floor tiling. And nothing else. Why not use the craftsmen who know how to use these materials? The carpenters and masons can work with the architects, and the association with them gives extraordinary results, and that is the testimony of the Bauhaus. Where are the borders? Where do they begin? Where do they end? It is possible to relive this and remember things. Once again, you see the hotel seen from the beach. And I also worked with the craftsmen. We're in the Bodrum Peninsula. The geological structure is very different. And you have to take into consideration the characteristics of the stone, and the craftsmen bring me examples and samples, and we need to work on these.
Şimdi bu şöyle bir çalışma yapayım dedim.
So I decided
Nedir bunların özellikleri diye böyle bir tablo çıkardım.
So I decided to work with stones, and I looked into the origins of the stones that I use.
Yeryüzüne çok yakın şeyler.
There are flooring stones that we use with different layers, and when you dig, obviously you have blocks of stones that are used to cover the floor. And the craftsmen I was working with asked me, how could we use these blocks? Because it was important to use the specificities of the stones. So we found different types of stones which helped us create floorings of different types. This is an example of Izmir. And here I would like to tell you an anecdote that occurred with stone craftsmen. Some stones reflect the sunlight. And those stones are in one place which we went to, and we cut the stones in different shapes to then use them for different purposes. But many years ago, these stones were used for buildings and not just for floorings. This is the example of such a building, the building of an artist who used those very stones, piling them up to create a building. It was built in 1974. So we then found other buildings built with stones. Here you can see how they are used both for floorings and for walls. And you can see that this is a real work of art. You see the use of bricks, of ceramics, of tiles. This is the house of a friend. On this particular picture, we decided to work differently. I asked my craftsmen to do something different. So we still wanted to use those very stones that are usually used for floorings these days, but to create walls, structures. Because of the sunlight, it was important to find a new vision. Here, you can see something very original. This is the door of a house built in Haldag, and this is a picture of how the stones are used for the structure of the house. So you can see the very different uses of these stones. This is, again, a very different experience with stones that are piled up over different layers. Stones with, again, different specificities, with an oxidation link to the metal present in the stones. In Manavgat, there are sandstones left. And as architects, we all have worries. We wonder about the impact of sunlight on a building, on the sustainability of the stone, on its appearance. Now I'd like to tell you about the city of Ayvalık, near the Aegean Sea. Again, a stone house. And again, you can see that olive trees and all sorts of trees are an integral part of the local architecture. And of course, these trees are loved, and people love to look at them, watch them from their houses. And so spaces have to be preserved. And here you can see a wonderful view. Now here is yet another house that was built in Sanaruk. It is built on a hill between two districts of Bodrum. And you can see here a closer outlook of the house, and this is the inside of the house with the use of red bricks. The client wanted the ceiling to be covered in these bricks. It is a very original result. And here is another interesting photo. I would like to share it with you, if I may. The owner is called Mine. She wanted an original bedroom. And she was asking me how she was going to put curtains on the windows. I told her not to. And a month later, she decided to put her bed just so. And this is extraordinary. She said the following. She said, we'd bought so many things during our travels over the past 25 years that we'd lost living space. And thanks to this layout, she had finally found a more functional use. And I will now finish with the fourth phase of my works, of urban design. On the one hand, you have urban planning. On the other, architectural design. And the fourth phase is somewhere in the middle of those two concepts. politics started taking an increasingly large space in our work, so much that we no longer know where our planning goes, or how to carry out the urban planning, or how that urban planning will be interpreted, for that matter. There is also a trend going from modernism to modernity, with a more social content, more economical, more conscious. And one of the main projects of that particular phase was the Konak Square in Izmir. It is a space that is 70 years old, but there again, politics and politicians gave all sorts of shapes to that square. Several competitions were organized without giving any probing results. But you have to know that in 1927, Le Corbusier was invited to Izmir, and he wrote a most interesting report. Different proposals were made. They seemed very agreeable, very pleasant. But none of these competitions turned these proposals into practice. So we decided to start working on that square in 2002, taking into account the history of Izmir and the important place that this Konak Square had for the neighborhood. Now, we were convinced of two things. First, the population talked about the clock tower. The population wanted the old Konak Square with the clock tower that had to come back because its place in the local literature was so important. And so we decided to work on the old traces of Izmir. When we started working on the square, you can see here an old photography. And then it was transformed in many different ways, so we decided to completely redefine the place. We decided to put the clock tower back in its original place of honor. And this is something that is enthusiastic to an architect, a designer. And the sun in that place is so strong that you can take magnificent photos. You can see here and here. You can see the different stones that are used to pave the square. In the town hall, in a cellar, we found old stones that were initially used for the square. And this is the inauguration of the new square with my new associate. And this is another event. You can see the square as it's currently used. The Izmir inhabitants are present. The population is increasing, so Izmir is looking for new public spaces. And so the Chamber of Architects of Izmir decided to prepare a new poster. Explaining that the entire coast had to be transformed with blocks that had to be building blocks that had to be replaced by green areas to ensure continuity between the Konak Square and the promenade, the Republic Avenue, that was used for official marches and events. And so there it is. You can see that this is a place of gathering used by all political parties, and it is a space that can hold up to 3 million people. Another interesting project, a different project, the room is asking that the conference is given near the mic. Yes, I'm going to speak for another 15 minutes, if I may. So, in Istanbul, we had another project. The project of Galata Port. Now, what is that? You can see here on this drawing that there is an architectural project suggested. It's by and large a space that was privatized, and it's a tourist project. So nobody took that project seriously, despite them going around universities to try and talk about it. We decided to build a team of 15 specialists, and we worked on a report. We made new proposals for Galata. We made a proposal for the whole area to regenerate the whole area circled here in black. And this is how we redesigned the place. And a new project was born this way. Now, this is another example of a monastery. We worked on this project also. Mr. Gürsel needs to talk into the microphone if he wants to be interpreted. Now, this is a tectonic area. This is what it used to look like, and thanks to the new project, you'll see here on the top left-hand side, we only had this postcard to know what we were supposed to do. This postcard was used by all restaurants on the coast. So we decided to restore this building as it used to be. And a young academic helped us in this design phase. But the stones that we used in our project were stones from the old building. We did not use any new material. We prepared new drawings. And here you can see one of our craftsmen working on the chapel. And he was one of the best in his line of work. I will now go fairly quickly over these photographs. I just wanted to show you the different ways in which we use wood, but unfortunately my time is limited. This is an interesting project. In Iraq, there is an ethnic group called Yazidi, and they have a temple with a bridge that links their community to that temple. So we redesigned that bridge, which was made of wood. And the final project, which is a cultural center at Kilandit, this was a transformation, an architectural transformation project for Ayvalık. This is the old building with the surrounding areas, with the roof. This was a protected building, and we always carried out these projects with the public. We always did our projects with the public, with consultations. And Marie-Hélène, if you'll allow me, I will make a few comments. It's not a manifesto, but a few reflections. In my career, the different phases have helped me understand that human life, was central to my projects. The Association for Environmental Preservation helps provide all of this to future generations. In all of my projects, I decided to use the redefinition, the reuse of old walls in order to preserve human life in different urban spaces. The production of economy and the belonging to an urban network. In my projects, form was, of course, a priority. And I always tried to remain original and intemporal. Living spaces were always my principal quest. Architectural projects, in my view, must meet the needs of the preservation of our cultural and human heritage. That's all I had to say, and I apologize for the length of my conference. Thanks for your attention.